She was 71 years old, blind in both eyes since a stroke 3 years prior. And every single night, while her daughter-in-law hosted dinner parties in the living room with the chandelier blazing and the good wine open, and laughter bouncing off freshly painted walls, Nora Mae Calloway made her way through the dark backyard by memory alone. 12 steps from the back porch, a slight left at the oak tree, one careful step up, and slept in a converted garden shed with a padlock on the outside that she could not operate herself. She needed help to get in. She needed help to get out. And the woman holding the key had made very certain that Nora understood just how much of a burden that was. But Nora didn't know something. She didn't know that 3,000 miles away in a forward operating base, in a country whose name the news had stopped saying out loud, her son Marcus was reading a letter. A letter that had been delayed 6 weeks by military routing. A letter written in the trembling handwriting of a 71-year-old woman who had spent 3 months trying to figure out how to say something is wrong here without sounding like a burden. She hadn't sent it to Marcus first. She'd sent it to his commanding officer, because Nora Mae Calloway had been raised to exhaust every other option before she bothered her child. If you believe that blood always finds its way home, subscribe right now and hit that bell, because what happens when Marcus Calloway walks through that front door is something you are absolutely not ready for. There are houses that hold memory in their walls, the way old wood holds water. Deep, quiet, structural. The Calloway house on Birchwood Lane in Clarksville, Tennessee, was that kind of house. Nora Mae moved into it in 1987 as a 29-year-old woman with a 6-month-old son on her hip. She had nothing else but a cardboard box of kitchen things and a cast-iron skillet her mother had pressed into her hands. Her husband, Roy Calloway, had been dead 11 months by then, killed by a drunk driver while walking home from the hardware store. Roy had been 27. Nora had been 28. Marcus had been 3 weeks old. The house on Birchwood Lane wasn't much to look at. 2 bedrooms, a tilted kitchen, and a back porch threatening to collapse. The landlord, Mr. Teta, was a slow-moving man who accepted partial payments without complaint. She worked 2 jobs, days at the elementary school cafeteria, evenings at a laundromat where she folded clothes while Marcus slept. She sang to him while she worked, old gospel songs that had been carrying women through impossible circumstances for generations. I don't feel no ways tired. I've come too far from where I started from. Marcus grew up hearing those songs. By the time Marcus was 12, Nora had saved enough to buy the house outright from old Mr. Teta. The deed was signed on a Thursday afternoon at a folding table in Tet's kitchen. She sat Marcus down. Everything I do, so you have something solid under your feet. You understand me? This paper means nobody can ever put us out. Nobody can ever make us feel like we don't belong somewhere. He held on to it through high school, community college, and through the decision to enlist at 22. He sent money home every month without fail, not because Nora asked. Nora never asked for anything, which was exactly why he sent it without being asked. Her name was Christine Marsh when Marcus met her, and she was 31 years old, recently relocated from Nashville. She was standing in the cereal aisle of a Kroger on a Saturday morning when Marcus knocked, her basket off the shelf, reaching for the same brand of granola. He apologized. She laughed. They talked for 40 minutes in the cereal aisle, and then kept talking over coffee next door. She was quick and bright, and laughed at the right moments, and asked real questions rather than performing interest. She had a directness that Marcus associated with people who had been through something hard and come out practical. She didn't flutter. She looked at him straight. He was deployed again 6 weeks later. They wrote letters, okay? Real letters, handwritten, sent through APO addresses. The kind of correspondence that requires deliberate thought, because you can't type and delete. You have to mean it or cross it out and mean something else instead. Their letters were long and detailed and slowly built the kind of interior knowledge of another person that dating apps spend years pretending to approximate. By the time Marcus came home on leave 14 months later, Christine knew his history, his philosophy, and his grief over his father's death. He had an uncomplicated love for his mother, Nora. Christine met Nora on that leave. Nora served sweet tea on the back porch and asked Christine about her family and her work in that gentle, methodical way of Southern women. Nora was conducting a full character assessment while appearing to simply be hospitable. After Christine left, Nora sat in her rocking chair for a long time. "She's sharp," Nora said finally. Marcus waited. "Sharp can go either way," Nora said. "Sharp can cut for you or cut at you." Marcus married Christine 14 months after that conversation. In a small ceremony at a church 2 blocks from Birchwood Lane, Nora held Marcus's arm down the aisle and cried in the specific way of mothers who are happy and terrified in exactly equal measure. Christine wore ivory and smiled through the whole ceremony. The flowers she'd chosen were white roses. She had brought white roses to every visit before the wedding too. Always to Nora, always with a warm smile and "I just thought of you when I saw these." Nora accepted them graciously. She noticed that Christine always bought white roses that were just barely past their peak, the kind that would look beautiful for exactly 1 day before beginning to drop petals. She didn't know what that meant. She didn't let herself decide yet. Marcus was redeployed 8 months after the wedding. Before he left, he sat with Nora and Christine at the kitchen table on Birchwood Lane. It was his mother's kitchen table, the one with the burn mark near the edge from when Marcus was 9 and left a hot pot handle resting against the wood. "I need you two to look out for each other," he said. "Mama's been here alone a long time. She's independent, but I need someone to check in." He looked at Nora. "I need you to let her." Nora had nodded calmly. Christine had reached across the table and covered Nora's hand with her own. "I'm going to take such good care of her, Marcus. I promise you." The stroke happened 11 weeks after Marcus deployed. Nora was at her kitchen sink, washing dishes, listening to the morning gospel program on the radio. Then she was on the floor, the radio still playing and the water still running, as the room kept tilting sideways. The neighbor, Clarence Webb, found her 40 minutes later when he came by to return a rake. He called the ambulance himself. The stroke damaged the optic nerves. The blindness came in stages over 6 weeks, a progressive dimming that Nora hoped would stop. It did not stop short of total. By the time Marcus was reached, Nora was home from the hospital, stable but fully without sight. Christine had moved into Birchwood Lane to help. Marcus was grateful. He called every week. Christine answered and gave him updates that were reassuring, framing Nora's adjustment as going remarkably well. Nora was adapting. Nora was doing physical therapy. Nora was navigating the house beautifully. Nora was in such good spirits. Nora, on these calls, when Christine handed her the phone, was carefully cheerful because Marcus was in a combat zone. Nora had spent 40 years protecting her son from things he could not fix from where he was standing, and because Christine was always present during the calls, seated just close enough that the quality of her listening was impossible to miss. The first change was the bedroom. 3 weeks after moving in, Christine stood in the doorway of Nora's bedroom, the master bedroom, the one with the good cross ventilation and the window that faced the magnolia tree Nora had planted in 1994, and told Nora in a voice calibrated to gentle practicality that she had given it considerable thought and believed it would be safer for Nora to sleep in the smaller room. "The master has that step up from the hallway," Christine explained. "With your vision the way it is, I just worry. The smaller room is more accessible, more manageable." Nora had lived in that house for 36 years. She knew the step up from the hallway the same way she knew her own hands. But Christine framed it as safety, and Nora accepted it. The smaller room was fine, quaint, narrow, but fine. Then the bathroom. "I'm having a contractor come in to update the master bath," Christine said. While that's happening, you'll use the hallway bathroom. The hallway bathroom was further from Nora's room, round a corner, past a rug edge that Nora caught her foot on twice in the first 3 days. The 2 weeks became 6. The sounds of actual construction were sporadic and unconvincing. But the master bathroom remained closed. Then came the evenings. Christine had begun hosting dinner parties, professional gatherings, a book club that met on Thursday evenings. The house was full of people who did not know Nora, who were sometimes startled to encounter her feeling her way along the hallway wall. "It's a lot for her," Christine told her guests, in a voice just loud enough for Nora to hear. "She gets overwhelmed by company." We tried to give her space. Nora began staying in her small room during the gatherings. Then Christine expressed, always gently, that the kitchen had become a safety issue. "I'll just bring you a plate," Christine said. The plates that arrived were not what Christine's guests were eating. Nora could tell by the temperature, by the smell, by the difference between something prepared with attention and something scraped from a container without it. She said nothing. She was still telling herself that this was adjustment, that Christine was overwhelmed by the responsibility, that things would normalize. Then Christine began talking about the shed. "It's the noise," Christine said. "The gatherings, the people, the late evenings. I can see it wears on you. I've been thinking. It's the shed out back. You know Mr. Crawford converted it for his mother-in-law a few years back. It's actually quite cozy when it's done right. More private, quieter, more your own space." Nora stood very still. "I'm in my own space," she said. "This is my house." A pause. "Of course it is," Christine said, in the tone of someone soothing an unreasonable child. "I only mean that you might be more comfortable." Nora said no. Christine did not push that night. She pushed the following week and the week after, incrementally, with variations of the same framing. Quieter, more independent, better rest, less disruption from the house activity. And then, one evening, she stopped asking. She simply appeared at the door of Nora's small room with a flashlight and said, in the voice of a decision already made, "I've set up the shed for tonight, just to try it, give it a chance." "I am not sleeping in a shed," Nora said. "Nora." The voice sharpened for just a fraction of a second before smoothing back to concerned. "You can barely navigate this house on your own. You nearly fell twice last week. Jed has a direct path, 12 steps. I've cleared it completely. There's nothing to trip over. You'll be safer." What Nora did not know in that moment, and would not know until much later, was that Christine had already moved Nora's medications, her extra clothing, her radio, and her Bible into the shed that afternoon. She had staged it while Nora was napping. Nora spent that first night in the shed because she had no medications where she was sleeping, and Christine had the key and claimed she could unfind the spare. That first night became the second, and then the pattern sat like concrete. The shed was approximately 12 feet by 14 feet. It had been used for garden tools and seasonal storage before Christine cleared it out and installed a cot, a small dresser, a space heater that worked unevenly, and a single lamp that Nora could not use. There was no bathroom. There was no running water. There was a bucket. Nora Mae Calloway, who had owned that property for 34 years, who had paid every tax on it and every repair, and raised her son in it, and buried her grief in its back garden, and planted a magnolia tree in its yard that was now taller than the house. Nora slept in a shed with a bucket and a space heater, while her daughter-in-law entertained in the living room 40 feet away. Every morning, Nora waited. She could not open the padlock from the inside. She waited for Christine to come unlock it, which Christine did when it suited her. Sometimes at 6 in the morning, sometimes at 9, once at nearly 11 on a Sunday, when Nora had been sitting on the edge of the cot since 5:30, listening to birds she could no longer see. She ate her meals outside, weather permitting, at a small table Christine had placed near the shed. When the weather didn't permit, Christine brought a tray. Clarence Webb, next door, noticed the tray. He noticed a lot of things. Clarence Webb was 68 years old, 22 years retired from the Clarksville Postal Service, and constitutionally incapable of minding his own business in situations that warranted the involvement of someone who cared. He had known Nora Mae since 1989. He had shoveled her walk in the bad winters when Marcus was too small to manage it. He had sat with her in the hospital waiting room when Marcus had his appendix out at 16. He had stood on this same back porch and eaten barbecue at every one of the neighborhood 4th of July gatherings Nora had hosted for 20 years running. He was not about to watch what was happening and tell himself it was none of his concern. The first thing he noticed was that Nora no longer came to her kitchen window in the morning. For as long as he had lived next door, Nora had stood at that window with her coffee while the day started. First with full sight, then after the stroke, by habit and memory, standing at the window, even without being able to see through it, because the ritual mattered. The window was always Christine now. The second thing was the shed light. Clarence's bedroom faced the back of both properties. He began noticing a light in the shed in the early morning hours, dim, steady, the kind of light that came from a small lamp or a phone. And then he noticed that the light was there well before Christine moved through the backyard in the morning, and he began calculating the interval, and the interval was always long, too long for a brief morning errand, long enough to have been there overnight. He confronted Christine directly once, in the backyard, in the measured voice of a man who had decided on straightforwardness over strategy. "Is Nora sleeping in that shed?" Christine smiled without flinching. "She prefers it, actually. She found the house too stimulating. You know how disorienting everything is for her now. The shed is quieter, more peaceful." It was her idea. Clarence looked at her for a long moment. "I'd like to hear that from Nora." "Of course," Christine said warmly. "Let her know you stopped by." He did not hear from Nora that day, did not hear from her the following day. On the third day, he was at his mailbox when he heard footsteps on the Calloway side of the fence. Slow, careful, the particular sound of someone navigating familiar ground with unfamiliar senses. "Nora." A pause. "Clarence." Her voice was low. "Careful. I'm at the fence. Northeast corner, by the Forsythia." The footsteps adjusted, and then she was at the fence, her hands finding the top rail, her face turned slightly upward in that way of people without sight who orient themselves by sound and air movement. He looked at her hands. The knuckles were dry and cracked from cold. There were red marks around both wrists, consistent with someone who spent time in low temperatures. Her face was thinner than he remembered. "Kella, tell me the truth. Where are you sleeping?" A very long silence. "I'm fine, Clarence. That's not what I asked." Another silence. And then her chin dropped slightly. Just slightly. Just enough. He had his answer. "Does Marcus know?" "Marcus," she said, "is in a war." Nora wrote the letter on a Tuesday evening in October. She wrote it in the shed by feel because she had learned to write by feel in the months since the blindness. Slowly, with a thick-tipped pen, pressing the paper against a clipboard so the lines stayed approximately straight. It took her most of the evening. She made mistakes and kept going. She didn't know exactly how the words looked on the page. She trusted that they made sense. She folded the paper carefully, 3 folds, the way her mother had taught her, and she placed it in an envelope, and she felt for the seam to make sure it was sealed. She had the address memorized. Not Marcus's direct APO address, the address for Marcus's unit commanding officer, a man named Colonel David Reyes, whose contact information Marcus had given her 2 deployments ago with the specific instruction that if there was ever a true emergency and she couldn't reach him, she should write to Reyes directly. "Don't use it for small things, Mama," Marcus had told her. "He's a busy man, but if something is genuinely wrong, he'll make sure I know." Nora had never used it. She used it now because she had spent 6 weeks trying to decide if what was happening to her qualified as an emergency or whether she was simply being difficult. And then she had spent another 3 weeks locked in a shed before dawn on a cold October morning waiting for her daughter-in-law to bring the key. And she had finally decided that yes, is qualified. She gave the letter to Clarence through the fence. She told him the address by memory. She told him to send it to priority and to use his return address, not hers. Clarence drove to the post office that same afternoon. He was back at his kitchen window by 3, watching. The letter reached Colonel Ray's administrative office 22 days after Clarence mailed it. The delay was routing mail to forward operating positions moved in irregular batches, and this particular batch had been held at a transfer station for 11 days due to a logistics issue that had nothing to do with Nora or her letter or the urgency with which she had written it. Colonel David Reyes was a 54-year-old man from San Antonio, Texas, who had served 28 years in the United States Army, who had 3 daughters of his own, and who had the particular quality of stillness that comes from having spent decades making decisions with incomplete cremation in high-stakes environments. He read Nora's letter once. He read it again. He set it down on his desk and sat with it for a moment. Then he sent for Staff Sergeant Marcus Calloway. Marcus came in, stood at ease, read his commanding officer's expression, and felt something cold settle in his chest before a single word was spoken. "Sit down, Calloway." Reyes slid the letter across the desk. "Marcus, read it." The thing about Marcus Calloway was that he had learned, through years of training and deployment, to process information before responding to it, to absorb a threat assessment without immediately acting on the adrenaline, to make decisions from clarity rather than from the first wave of feeling. He read his mother's letter, her careful, uneven handwriting, the sentences slightly crooked on the page, the words of a woman who had tried to minimize as she wrote and still could not fully contain what was happening, and he was very still for a long time. Then he folded the letter. "Sir," he said, "I need to request emergency family leave." Colonel Reyes had already pulled up the paperwork. "It's approved, Sergeant. Tia on a flight in 14 hours. While Marcus was in the air, something else was moving. Clarence Webb, who had spent 31 days watching and waiting since mailing Nora's letter, had spent some of those days doing research. He was a methodical man, a former civil servant, accustomed to records and processes. He knew that property records were public. He knew how to access them. He had also, during those 31 days, taken his own kind of notes, dates, times, photographs taken from his bedroom window with a digital camera his granddaughter had given him for Christmas 2 years prior. The images were clear enough. Christine crossing the yard in the early morning with a key. Nora waiting at the shed door. Nora eating outside at the small table in temperatures that had no business requiring anyone to eat outside. Nora's hands on the fence rail, cracked and red. He had also spoken, carefully and without identifying himself, to a legal aid clinic in Clarksville. The intake attorney was a 36-year-old woman named Patricia Say, who worked elder law cases and whose expression had gone very flat and very focused during Clarence's account, and who had asked him to come in the following morning with everything he had. He had come in. He had brought the photographs. He had brought his written log. He had brought in a sealed plastic sleeve, a copy of the original deed to the Calloway property at Birchwood Lane, which he had obtained through the county recorder's office because those records were public, because Nora had mentioned a deed signing in 1989 more than once over the years, and because Clarence had a feeling that the deed was going to matter. It mattered. The deed listed one owner, Nora Mae Calloway, not Marcus, not Christine, not jointly, not in trust. Nora, sole owner, unencumbered, no liens, no secondary signatories. When Marcus had married Christine, no property agreement had been signed, no deed transfer had occurred. Christine's name appeared on no document connected to the Birchwood Lane property in any county record. Patricia Assay reviewed this for approximately 90 seconds. Then she looked up at Clarence. The woman being held in the shed, she said, carefully, owns the property. Yes, Clarence said. The woman with the key to the shed lock. Yes, Patricia would say. Open a new file on her computer. I'm going to need you to tell me everything from the beginning. Marcus Calloway landed at Nashville International Airport at 6:22 in the morning. He had not slept on either flight. He had sat in his seat with his mother's letter in his jacket pocket, and he had gone through it word by word for the duration of 2 flights and 1 layover, and he had arrived at a state of feeling that was beyond anger. That was something slower and more tectonic, a deep, grinding shift in the foundation of things. He rented a car. He drove the 45 minutes to Clarksville without music, without the radio, nothing but the early morning highway and his own thinking. He pulled onto Birchwood Lane at 7:49 a.m. The house looked the same from the front. The magnolia tree his mother had planted was enormous now, spreading above the roofline, magnificent. The porch was clean. The flower boxes on the front windows had new plantings in them, something Christine had done, something that looked curated and deliberate, kind of curb appeal that announces a certain kind of woman is managing this property. Marcus sat in the rental car for exactly 1 minute. Then he got out. He didn't go to the front door. He went around the side of the house, through the gate, into the backyard. He stood in the backyard of the house he had grown up in, and he saw the shed. He saw the padlock on the shed door. He saw the small table outside the shed with 2 legs slightly uneven on the yard, a table small enough to be obviously supplementary, obviously not the table where the household ate. He stood there for a moment. Then he walked to the shed door, and he knocked. "Mama," from inside, a sound, movement. Then his mother's voice, rough with mourning, with age, with weeks of sleeping in temperatures that were not right. "Marcus, it's me." A pause. Then, "The lock, I know." He looked at the padlock. Standard combination lock, cheap hardware store variety. Hey, went back to the gate, found a piece of pipe stacked against the fence, came back. It took him 2 attempts. The door swung open. His mother was sitting on the edge of the cot, dressed already. She always dressed first thing. It was her habit, her dignity. With her hands folded in her lap and her face oriented toward the sound of him, and her eyes, his mother's eyes that had watched him every day of his life, clouded and still. He stepped inside. He sat beside her on the cot. He put his arm around her. Nora Mae Calloway was not a woman who cried easily. She had raised a son on her own and buried a husband she barely got to know and lost her sight and kept going and kept going. She did not cry easily. She pressed her face against her son's shoulder and she shook, not with crying, exactly, with the specific physical release of a person who has been holding themselves together by force of will for a very long time and has just felt for the first time in months that something solid is holding them instead. Marcus held his mother in a garden shed and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "I'm here." Then he said, "This is done." He walked into his mother's house through the back door. His mother's house. Said that to himself as he put his hand on the back door handle. His mother's house, his mother's kitchen, his mother's table with the burn mark. Christine was in the kitchen. She was at the counter with a mug of coffee, wearing the kind of silk robe that cost more than 3 weeks of cafeteria wages. And she turned when the door opened with an expression that moved through several phases in rapid succession: surprise, recalibration, warmth. "Marcus." She set down the mug and moved toward him with open arms. "You're home." "I didn't know. Why didn't you call?" "I would have. Where's my mother's bedroom?" "I want you to walk me through every room and explain to me exactly how my mother, who owns this house, who raised me in this house, who has her name on it, the deed to this house. I want you to explain to me how she ended up sleeping in a padlocked shed in the backyard." Christine's expression shifted. Something in it sharpened, readying, the way a person looks when they are preparing a version of events. "Marcus, she needs more care than I can provide inside the house. She was becoming a fall risk. She was disoriented. It wasn't safe." He repeated. "She was confused. She was. She wrote to my commanding officer," Marcus said. "She wrote him a letter because she didn't want to worry me while I was deployed. She wrote it by touch because she can't see. She described sleeping outside. She described waiting to be let out in the mornings. She described what you brought her to eat." The color in Christine's face was doing something complicated. "You know how she can be. I broke the padlock to get to her." The room went quiet. Outside, through the kitchen window, they could both hear Nora making her way slowly up the back porch steps, one careful step at a time. "I want you to leave," Marcus said. "Today, this house is my mother's. Her name is on the deed, and only her name, and you will not spend another night in it." Christine pulled herself up. Something cold came into her face, the warmth fully gone now, the calculation unmasked. "I'm your wife," she said. "I have rights. You have until I carry my mother's things back from that shed." He looked at her directly. "After that, I called Patricia Osei." Something moved across Christine's face at that name, something that looked like the specific alarm of someone discovering that a door they thought was locked has been open for some time. Marcus had called Patricia Osei from the airport. Clarence had given him her number, calling Marcus's cell from a number Marcus didn't recognize. Q-Tip introducing himself in 3 sentences, telling Marcus what he had done and what he had found, and who he had talked to. "She's already filed a petition," Clarence told him, "for your mother. Emergency protective order. The hearing is Thursday." Marcus had sat in the airport terminal at 6 in the morning with his duffel bag between his feet and listened to a 60-year-old retired mail carrier explain that while Marcus was overseas, this man had taken photographs and kept records and found a lawyer and started a legal process to protect Marcus's mother. He had to work very hard to speak. "Why?" Marcus asked finally. "Why did you do all this?" A short pause. "'Cause she shoveled my walk when my hip was bad," Clarence said. "And because nobody else was." Patricia Osei had filed the emergency petition 8 days before Marcus landed. The petition cited documented neglect, isolation, deprivation of adequate shelter, controlled access to necessities, and requested immediate legal protection for Nora Mae Calloway as a vulnerable adult under Tennessee state law. She had submitted Clarence's photographs. She had submitted the property deed. She had submitted a letter from Nora's former physician documenting the conditions of her care, requirements, and the unsuitability of unheated outdoor structures as sleeping accommodations for a stroke survivor. She had also, with Nora's telephone authorization, conducted through Clarence's phone, during a brief window when Christine was away from the property, submitted a sworn statement from Nora herself, 7 pages, dictated by a blind woman sitting on a cot in a garden shed, transcribed word for word by Patricia Osei's paralegal. Every date, every meal, every morning, waiting for the key. The petition had been granted the previous Friday. Christine had not yet been served. She was served at 11:14 that Tuesday morning, 40 minutes after Marcus walked into the kitchen, by a process server who rang the front doorbell while Christine's single-packed suitcase sat in the front hallway and Marcus sat at his mother's kitchen table, drinking coffee that his mother, for the first time in months, had made in her own kitchen. Nora stood at the kitchen counter. She had her hands on the edge of the counter, orienting herself, relearning the space that had always been hers. A particular way the countertop felt under her palms, the distance from the sink to the stove, the slight draft from the window above the dish rack. Marcus watched her. She turned the burner on under the percolator. She had always used a percolator, not a drip machine. She said it made better coffee, and she was right. And she measured the grounds by feel, by the way the scoop settled by years of practice with this exact sequence of motions. "You always made it too strong," Marcus said. "You always drank it anyway." He laughed. He hadn't laughed since the airport. It came out rough and surprised, like something shaken loose. Nora's mouth curved. She poured 2 cups, and she carried them to the table, both hands wrapped around both cups, moving slowly, feeling the distance, setting them down carefully. She found her chair, the chair she had sat in at this table for 34 years, and she sat. Marcus sat across from her. He wrapped his hands around his cup. "Mama, don't," she said gently. "I should have Marcus." Her voice was firm, not harsh, firm. The voice she had used when he was 12 and 16 and 22. The voice that meant, "I am telling you the truth, and I need you to receive it. You were doing your job. I raised you to do your job and to do it completely. You didn't know. That is not the same as not caring. You hear me?" He looked at his mother's face. Her eyes, clouded and still, facing slightly to the left of him, orienting on his voice. "You wrote to Reyes," he said. "That was the emergency line. You never used it before." "No? What made you finally use it?" A pause. She lifted her coffee cup, set it back down. "It was a Tuesday morning," she said, "early, still dark. I was sitting on that cot, waiting for her to come with the key, and I was listening to the birds starting up, and I was trying to name them by sound like I used to do with you when you were small. You remember that?" "I remember. I got 3 of them. Mockingbird, cardinal, some kind of warbler, I think. And I thought, your father would have known the warbler. He knew every bird in this county." She paused. "I thought, Roy didn't live to 40. And I have been sitting in this shed for 6 weeks, waiting for a 29-year-old woman to decide when I'm allowed out of it. And Nora Mae, that is enough of that." Marcus was quiet. "So I wrote the letter," she said. "I asked Clarence to send it. And I waited. I'm sorry it took so long. You're here now." She reached across the table. Her hand found his. "You're here now," she said again. "It's the thing about you, Marcus. You always come home." The divorce proceedings began 40 days later. Christine, who had left the house on Birchwood Lane with 1 suitcase and a specific expression that mixed fury with calculation, had retained a family law attorney and filed for a share of marital assets within 3 weeks. Patricia S.A. responded. She had been preparing for this. The marital assets, as itemized in the filing, included the property at Birchwood Lane. Christine's attorney argued that as Marcus's spouse during the period of residence and as the primary caregiver, the word caregiver appeared 7 times in the filing, which Patricia noted with a particular quality of patience. Christine had an equitable interest in the property. Patricia submitted the deed. Sole owner Nora Mae Calloway. Not marital property. Never marital property. Not acquired during the marriage. Not contributed to by Christine in any documented or evidenced way. A property owned outright by Nora Mae Calloway since 1989, predating Marcus's marriage by 24 years. She then submitted the emergency protective order. She submitted the 7-page sworn statement. C submitted Clarence Webb's photographs, time-stamped, dated, clear. She submitted the medical documentation of Nora's condition and the temperatures recorded during the weeks of shed habitation. She submitted Nora's medical bills, the ones that Christine had failed to file with Nora's insurance for 6 months, which Patricia had discovered during the document review process, which had resulted in 2 of Nora's prescriptions going temporarily unfilled because the pharmacy had been told the coverage had lapsed. The prescriptions. Patricia had asked Nora about medications when she first took the case. In that thorough, methodical way of experienced elder law attorneys, Nora had mentioned, carefully, that there had been a period when her blood pressure medication had run out and it had taken some time to get it refilled. Some time. 17 days. 17 days during which a stroke survivor had been without her blood pressure medication. Patricia did not raise her voice when she was in court. She did not need to. She presented the documentation in the measured sequence of someone who is organized. The truth into an architecture that speaks for itself, and she allowed that architecture to stand in front of the judge and simply be what it was. The judge reviewed it. Judge looked at Christine's attorney. The judge asked the attorney in the particular tone of a jurist who has heard many things in many courtrooms, but is choosing to give this specific question the deliberateness it deserves, whether counsel wished to proceed with the claim on the property. Counsel, after a brief consultation with his client, withdrew the property claim. The divorce was finalized in 91 days. Christine received nothing connected to Birchwood Lane. She received no spousal support. She received, in the final accounting, the contents of a joint checking account that Marcus had opened at the start of the marriage, an account that held, the time of the divorce, $4,062. She had expected a house. She had expected accounts. She had expected the accumulated stability of a military career and a property and a life that she had spent 2.5 years positioning herself to inherit. She received $4,062 and a judgment in the court record that would follow her name through every background check for the foreseeable future. She left Clarksville. No one heard from her again. Marcus knocked on Clarence Webb's door on a Saturday afternoon, 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized. He had a plate of food covered in foil. He had a bottle of good bourbon, and he had a handwritten letter. Clarence opened the door and looked at these things, and looked at Marcus and said, "You didn't have to do all that." "I know," Marcus said. "That's not why I did it." They sat on Clarence's porch for 3 hours that afternoon. They ate. They drank moderate quantities of the bourbon. They watched the neighborhood do its Saturday things. Clarence told Marcus about the letter, about Patricia Assay, about the photographs, about the long weeks of watching and waiting. Marcus listened to all of it. "She didn't want me to know," Marcus said when Clarence finished. "No," Clarence said. "She didn't want you to worry. That's the thing about her. She's been protecting me my whole life, even when she was the one who needed protecting." Clarence was quiet for a moment. "She named me in the letter, you know," he said. "To you, when she wrote to the colonel. She said, 'Clarence Webb next door is watching out for me. I thought you should know that someone who knew your father is keeping an eye on things.'" Marcus looked at him. "You knew my father?" "Briefly. Used to walk home from work down 4th Street. I had a route on 4th Street back then. We talked for a few minutes most days." He was Clarence looked out at the magnolia tree in Nora's front yard. "He was a good man, laughed easily, talked about you before you were even born, had all these plans." They sat with that for a while. "Thank you," Marcus said finally. "Roy would have done it," Clarence said simply. "Seemed like the least I could do." The first thing Marcus did when Christine left was carry his mother's things back into the house. The second thing he did was repaint the master bedroom. He did it himself, over 2 days, moving furniture, taping edges, rolling paint in a color his mother had chosen when she first painted it in 1994. A warm yellow that she had called sunshine without the glare. A color she had picked from a sample book by asking Marcus, who was 9, to tell her which one looked like a warm hug. He had pointed to the yellow. She had used it ever since. He couldn't tell her the color looked right. She couldn't see it, so he described it to her instead. He sat in the newly painted room while the paint dried, and he told his mother exactly what it looked like. The way the afternoon light came through the window and landed on the yellow walls and made the whole room feel like the inside of something warm. The way the magnolia tree outside the window had grown so large that its branches reached the sill and you could see the leaves shifting. Nora sat on the edge of her bed in her room with a window, and she listened. "The quilt," she said, "is the blue quilt on the chair." Marcus looked. The blue quilt, the one Nora's mother had made, the one that had been on that chair in that room since before Marcus was born, was on the chair where it had always been. He had found it in the shed, folded under Nora's cat, and he had washed it and placed it back where it belonged. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Right where it always was." Nora nodded. Her hands were folded in her lap, still slightly rough from the cold, still slightly marked from the weeks they had not been warm enough. But her face was different, eased, some long-held tension released from around her mouth and her brow. "Tell me about the magnolia," she said. He talked about the magnolia tree for a long time. There are things that houses remember. The Calloway house on Birchwood Lane remembered. Nora at 29 with a baby on her hip and a cast-iron skillet and a will that nothing had been able to break. It remembered Marcus at 12, watching his mother sign her name to a deed. It remembered gospel music from a small radio on the kitchen counter. It remembered the burn mark on the table and the yellow walls and the magnolia tree growing from a seedling to something enormous and permanent. It had also, for a period of months, been asked to hold something different, something cold, something that moved through its rooms with a key and a silk robe and a deliberate, patient cruelty that understood that the slowest wounds are the least visible. The house had held that too, and then it had let it go. Nora Mae sat on her back porch on a Sunday morning in April, 6 months after Marcus came home. She had her coffee. She had the radio, the gospel program, the one she had been listening to for 40 years. She had the April air, which in Tennessee in April carries the smell of things beginning. She had her son's voice from inside the kitchen, where he was making breakfast, talking to her through the screen door, telling her about something he'd read, something that made her laugh, the easy, ongoing conversation of two people who know each other so completely that the silence is comfortable and talking is comfortable, and both are just different ways of being present. She had Clarence's voice too, from over the fence he had taken to sitting on his own porch on Sunday mornings, and they had developed a habit of talking across the fence while their respective coffees grew cold. And this had become one of those small rituals that neighborhoods are actually made of. Underneath all the official business of proximity. "You hear that warbler?" Clarence called. Karen tilted her head. She listened. "Yes," she said. "There he is." She found him by sound. She named him. She held him in her attention for a moment, this small creature doing what it was built to do in the April air of a yard that had always been hers, that no one had ever actually had the power to take. She thought of Roy, who would have known what kind of warbler. She thought of Marcus, who was making eggs in the kitchen. She thought of Clarence, who had mailed a letter. She thought of a 29-year-old woman arriving at a house with $60, and a cast-iron skillet, and the absolute unbroken intention to build something that would last. It lasted, she thought. "Everything I built is still standing." She lifted her coffee cup. She sat in the April morning. She listened to the warblers singing in a yard that belonged to her. Fate doesn't announce itself. It doesn't carry a sign, doesn't come when you call it. Sometimes it comes in the form of a retired postal worker with a camera and a neighbor's phone number. Sometimes it comes in the form of a commanding officer who understands that a mother's letter requires a son's presence. Sometimes it was already there, written into a deed in 1989, by a woman who understood that ownership is not just a document. It is a declaration that says, "I was here, and I built this, and it is mine." The cruelty that moves into the spaces left by love counts on one thing, that nobody is watching, but somebody is always watching. Subscribe, hit the bell, 'cause on this channel, the patient always outlasts the cruel, and what a woman builds with her bare hands, nobody takes away.